Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History with your host, Mr. Ancharsky. We're going to wrap up Unit 1 by talking about what's going on in Western Europe. Today, we're going to look at the Middle Ages. Yay! Wonderful! Hooray! My glasses are transitioning right now to become normal glasses. So that will be something that you will see if you're looking up here in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. But you should be focused on the words on the text. Anyway, whatever. Who cares? Bell work on the screen. Describe the Great Schism. Remember, writing full sentences. My God. All right. So today we're going to look at the Middle Ages. We're going to look at medieval Europe. And we're going to break this down into two parts, actually. We're going to talk about the early Middle Ages first, and then we'll talk about the high or late Middle Ages second. So the lesson objective for today and for our next presentation is explain the causes and consequences of political decentralization in Europe between 1200 and 1450. Because largely Europe is broken up into different kingdoms, into a very decentralized collection of independent kingdoms that don't like each other. Then you're going to be able to explain the impact of agriculture on social organization in Europe in that time period too. So pay attention especially to, hint, hint, manorialism. Let's first look at some general themes real quick. Well, the time period of the Middle Ages is typically going to regard this era between the end of the classical period, the end of the Western Roman Empire in the West, and the modern era, which is typically regarded as beginning with the Renaissance. And we'll talk about the Renaissance more in our second unit. But this time period between the classical and modern era in European history is known as the Middle Ages. And really, we divide the Middle Ages into two different parts. There's the early Middle Ages, the time period between the end of the Roman Empire and about 1000 CE. And then there's the High Middle Ages. But each of these distinct periods of Middle Age history is characterized by different political developments. For example, in the early Middle Ages, largely Europe is mostly decentralized. We have the dominance of the Catholic Church. We have very much a lack of trade. Whereas in the late or high Middle Ages, this is when we start to see more centralization slowly but surely happening. We start to see an increase of trade by the end of the Middle Ages. It's very important that you kind of get these chronology points right. So throughout the early Middle Ages, a lack of trade. But throughout the High Middle Ages, by the end of the High Middle Ages, that's when we start to see Europe emerge as a trading power, not on the same scale as Asia. That won't happen until our fourth unit. But let's look kind of specifically at what's going on in the early Middle Ages first. And you might see some different terms to describe this time period. Medieval means the same thing as the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages. That's typically something we don't use as historians anymore to describe the Middle Ages, but it generally describes how we do have the dominance of the Catholic Church that is preventing kind of an interest in Greek and Roman classical writing. So let's look at some general themes throughout kind of the Middle Ages in general. Well, generally, Europe is going to be in a state of decentralization. The Roman Empire is no longer there. There's no longer a unified political presence in Western Europe. We do have a system largely based on feudalism. So there isn't really a unified empire in Europe, but we do have kind of the one thing that is keeping everybody together, at least religiously and culturally, is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is going to emerge as really the only stable source of political power in the Middle Ages in Western Europe after the end of the Roman Empire. And really, the Middle Ages is going to be generally a time of extreme religious devotion. Catholicism is extremely important culturally and politically. So Catholicism is really going to be the basis for Western culture in Western Europe, I should say. So the Catholic Church will direct a lot of intellectual and cultural developments, but they have their own political power as well, as we're going to see. And if you ever see the term the church, it is referring to the Roman Catholic Church. But the Middle Ages are important because of this religious devotion in a way, because this religious identity of Catholicism is going to be the origins of how Europe as a continent culturally perceives itself. And we call this idea of the cultural perception that all of Europe is united by Christianity. This is the idea of Christendom. So Christendom is the notion that political, cultural identity is very much related to religious identity, in this case, Catholicism in the West. And as such, we are going to see a lot of religious intolerance in the West. We do see the persecution of Jews. Jews are going to be forced to live in special areas of cities called ghettos. And that's going to be very much true for much of European history until the Enlightenment. So if you're thinking about kind of religious intolerance and using Jews as an example, we do see their seclusion into special neighborhoods called ghettos. There's also extreme hostility to Islam during this time period. And that's going to be especially true when we start talking about the Crusades, and that's in our second part. So this is really going to be the start of what defines Europe, and its identity at first is defined through religion, through Christianity. But let's look at the early Middle Ages in much more depth. Well, let's first look at that first lesson objective of what is causing decentralization. Really, there are a few reasons. Probably the most logistically important reason is the fact that there's no longer a Roman Empire. We do see that after the fall of the Roman Empire, we do see Western Europe divided up into different smaller kingdoms. And these kingdoms are going to be extremely politically decentralized. They all basically practice feudalism, as we'll talk about in a second. But these kingdoms are largely going to be the carved up remains of the Roman Empire. And they're carved up by, you guessed it, Germanic invaders, by those that tried to take over the Western Roman Empire. And they include groups like the Franks. They'll largely comprise of what will be modern day France. They'll make their own very decentralized empire located and centered in the city of Aachen right here. I've been there actually. We also have the Lombards in Northern Europe. They'll pop up occasionally. And then we have the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons, they will form their own series of kingdoms across what is today England and parts of Scotland and Wales. So we have the fall of the Roman Empire as one of the primary reasons why Europe is so decentralized. But another reason why Europe is so decentralized is that really there's going to be a very dominant political institution that emerges that really will exert their own political influence at the expense of different kingdoms. And that institution is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church during the Middle Ages is basically, it's helpful to think of it as just another kingdom. It's going to view itself as the supreme religious and, in a sense, political authority of Western Europe. And we see that basically the church will take on a role of being its own challenge to secular authority. And really, we see that best through the example of Charlemagne. Charlemagne is a dude, a king, who is going to form what is called the Carolingian Empire. He will unite different Frankish groups together. But ultimately, who's going to okay all of this? Because there is this idea that political leaders are not the religious leaders in Western Europe, we're going to see that Charlemagne will get his power politically through the Pope. And on Christmas, 800 CE, we do see that Charlemagne will be coronated or given the right to rule and crowned by the Pope of the Catholic Church. So essentially, the Pope, with this example of Charlemagne, is going to set a precedent that in order to gain any sort of political legitimacy, you have to be approved by the Pope. You have to be officially coronated or given the right to rule by the papacy, by the Catholic Pope. So really the Pope is going to be kind of the kingmaker, if you will. He's the one who gets to decide who gets to be king. He's the one where all political legitimacy comes from at the end of the day. So the Pope is going to kind of encourage a decentralized system. He doesn't want one single unified empire that could potentially challenge his power and the challenge of the authority of the Catholic Church. So pay attention to kind of examples of how the Catholic Church is impacting the secular or non-religious world. Well, another reason why we have such decentralization is that political power is based on land and who gets to own land. So we are going to see a lot of competition for land in Western Europe, particularly after people tend to die. For example, with the Carolingian Empire, formed by Charlemagne and his sons, we eventually will see that there's going to be a dispute that emerges in this Carolingian Empire, where we have the breakup of the Carolingian Empire into different parts that reflect the different sons of, and descendants, I should say, of Charlemagne. And the Treaty of Verdun is going to be an example of how even when centralized states formed, they're oftentimes going to be divided and broken up based on ideas of inheritance. So to quote Bill Wirtz, we have France and not France, for example. So there is going to be a lot of conflict over inheritance and who gets to claim certain parts of Europe. So really kind of this conflict is best demonstrated in things like the Treaty of Verdun, this breakup of the Carolingian Empire. And you can see this kind of mess that Europe is throughout the Middle Ages. I believe this is the Middle Ages by the 1200. So you will see a series of small independent kingdoms all across Western Europe. And don't get confused, this right here, this Holy Roman Empire, it's not a unified empire. It's a collection of over 300 different competing states, essentially, with their own kingdoms, their own monarchies, their own traditions. So a lot of decentralization happens even within these centralized states. They tend to just be broken up based on ideas of inheritance. But finally, kind of the biggest expression of decentralization is how people organize their kingdoms. And they organize their kingdoms through something we've encountered before, feudalism. So generally, when we see the collapse of highly centralized states, sometimes we see the emergence of feudalism. And as we remember, feudalism is this political and military relationship, that's what it is at the end of the day, of a king granting land to a noble, who in exchange provides loyalty and military service to that king. So feudalism is, at the end of the day, a political and military relationship, and this contrasts with another form of system that we'll talk about in a second. But why is feudalism specifically going to emerge in Western Europe? Well, really because of two things. Well, Western Europe doesn't have a unified political system. And as such, there are going to be a lot of local threats to monarchies across Western Europe. And these threats are mostly from outside invaders. For example, we have the Vikings. The Vikings are going to invade and raid many parts of Northern Europe. If you're an Irish monk, beware of the Vikings. But we do have invasions from other groups as well. We have invasions generally, if we're talking about the fall of the Roman Empire time period, we have invasions from Germanic groups. But we also have invasions as we see the rise of Islam as well. We see the rise of Muslim Spain, these invasions from the Moors and the Iberian Peninsula. So there is a demand for some form of organization. We do need to unite at least a little bit in order to repel these outside invaders. We need protection. Let's adopt feudalism. But why feudalism specifically? Why not just pay armies to defend localities, to defend local communities? Well, that's largely because there's no money. And there's no money because there's no centralized empire. And because there's no centralized empire, there's no trade. And because there's no trade, there's no money. But why is there no money, etc.? So we do see a general period of economic decline in which there isn't common currencies. And that's going to lead to a choice. You can either not be defended, or you can raise a military by granting land to people who will serve in your military. So the idea of feudalism is going to be very attractive in an era when there isn't centralized states. We see the rise of territorial lords who are going to delegate power through this mutual obligation exchange known as feudalism. And essentially, what does feudalism look like in Western Europe? Well, essentially, to use fancier terms to describe Western Europe specifically, we see that it's a system in which a king grants land or a fief to a noble or a vassal. The vassal then swears loyalty or homage to a king, and they will serve in their military. So we do see a very complicated social hierarchy emerging during these times when there are threats to the stability of these communities in Western Europe. I'm going to skip John Green, but you should watch that video. It's Dark Ages is the video title. So what is going to result from all of this decentralization? Well, we are going to see that Europe, Western Europe specifically, is going to be dominated by landed aristocrats, by people who get their power by owning land and by being born to a special family, to a noble family. So Europe is going to be very decentralized. There isn't strong monarchies, but rather there's strong aristocracies. There are strong nobles. But we're also going to see that there is a very unique class structure that is forming in Europe because of this feudal model. We do see that there is a class hierarchy based on the so-called estates. And these estates are different classes of people. And these classes include the clergy, the first estate. They are the leaders of the Catholic Church. We have the nobility. Those are the guys, the gals, or well, there's no gals. There are gals, obviously, in Western Europe, but there are very few ladies who do have political power. And we'll talk about that more in our second unit in a little bit in just a second. But there's a class hierarchy, as I said before. First estate, clergy, religious leaders. Second estate, nobility, the aristocracy. Below them, the commoners. They're the third estate. That's everyone else. There isn't really a strong merchant class in Western Europe until the end of the Middle Ages. There isn't really a strong artisan class as well. Things are very decentralized in all aspects politically, but there is a very rigid social hierarchy that people really can't challenge until capitalism, but we'll get there. But we also see that because political power is based on land ownership, you need to get as many pieces of land as possible. And one way you get land is through invasions, through military conquest. So feudalism is going to fuel a lot of political fights within Western Europe. We are going to see for that reason the building of important castles. And castles are a kind of an expression of how militarily and politically divided Europe is during the Middle Ages. We see that in this picture right here. I actually took this picture. This is a castle in, I want to say Poland. This is the largest castle actually in the world. It's a brick castle. It's called Malbrook Castle. And you don't need to know that, but it's an interesting thing that I know about and I was at. That's my professor right there and one of my fellows' arms right there. Anyway, let's keep going. Another thing about feudalism actually is that it is going to have kind of a new role for women. And we'll talk about women in Western Europe more in our second unit, but needless to say, it kind of sucks. Because women, especially noble women, are viewed as property. They are kind of a tool for people to marry into wealthier families. Hey, your dad owns Burgundy. Oh, what if I married your daughter? And then after the dad dies, I get to inherit that land. So women are kind of viewed as bargaining chips for marriage. So women are viewed essentially as the property of their fathers. And that's going to be reinforced politically. But speaking of kind of how feudalism will change, feudalism is going to eventually kind of become more centralized as we see the Middle Ages come to a close. And largely, we do see the more centralized nature of Western Europe by the end of the Middle Ages. So about 1500 CE. We do see that largely because of two factors. Well, for one thing, we do see that there will be intense military conflicts in the High Middle Ages. We are going to see large-scale invasions undertaken by kings. For example, we have William the Conqueror, who is a Norman, a guy from France, who is going to invade England. But in order to kind of direct this massive invasion, more power, more organizational power has to be given to the king at the expense of the nobility. So we do see that military conflicts that require large amounts of military organization are going to see more centralized monarchs. Another example is the 100 Years' War. You don't need to know the specifics. Basically, King of France, King of England, they're at each other's throats. There's a massive invasion of France by England. And we see here that we do start to see more power being given to the kings of France and England. But another thing that we'll see more centralization is going to be the idea of nationalism. And nationalism is something we will discuss more in our second unit, but also to a degree in our third unit and definitely beyond. It's the idea that you belong not to the service of another noble, not to the service of your community even, but to a nation of people as a whole. You are fighting not for the village of or the city of Paris, but you're fighting for France. You're not fighting for London, you're fighting for England. And because of this kind of overarching identity, that's more than just a single community, it's more of a collection of it. We see this idea of a nation emerging. So to use kind of a modern example, we see ourselves not necessarily as members of a state, members of an Arizona community, for example, but we see ourselves as belonging to the United States as a whole. So no one is fighting in the United States for Arizona. You're fighting for the nation as a whole if you serve in the US military. And it's a very similar thing in France and England as we're seeing develop. We are seeing this idea that you belong not to your local community, but to the nation as a whole. And yet, despite the fact that we do see generally more centralized states by the end of the Middle Ages, there are some attempts to limit or curb the influence of the monarchy. And we see that in France and England. In England, we have the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta is going to be a document that lists out the rights of the nobles that the King of England can't take away. For example, we see that a noble can't lose his land unless he is convicted of a crime, lawfully, meaning. So the Magna Carta is going to promote the protections of the nobility. It is limiting the power of the king. And another way that the king is being limited in his power is who gets to approve what laws he passes. And we see eventually the creation of an institution called Parliament. Parliament, it exists today in England, but back then in the 1200s, it was intended as a way to limit the authority of the king. Parliament is a collection of the nobles, and essentially the nobles have to approve of what laws the king wants to pass. And it's a very similar institution as the Estates General. The Estates General exists in France. It's essentially a meeting point for the nobility, for the clergy, for elites of the commoner class. They all have to get together in the Estates General and approve of whatever laws the King of France once passes. And the Estates General, well, kind of something that weakens it is that the king can dissolve it whenever he wants to. That's not something that the English kings can do in Parliament. But we'll talk about the Estates General more when we start talking about the choppy French Revolution. So you should be able to answer this question right here. What is causing the rise of decentralization? What is contributing to it? And what does feudalism look like in Western Europe? And by the end of the Middle Ages, how is it changing? So let's look at some social developments and economic ones as well. So economically speaking, we do see that Western Europe is largely focused not on trade, but on agriculture. And largely that's because there's a general decline in trade after the fall of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, as we remember from Unit 0, built up infrastructure, they built roads, they built cities. But after they go away, who's going to take care of the roads? Well, it's not going to be the most powerful empire that the Western world has known. It's going to be left up to communities. And communities apparently can't do the job. So we are going to see a lot of de-urbanization. We are going to see that people, after the Roman Empire falls apart, they're going to flock to local agricultural rural communities. And we do see that to protect these local communities, we see the rise of something called serfdom. So I'll talk about serfdom more in a second, but generally people are going away from cities after the fall of the Roman Empire, and we do see the rise of agriculture as the basis of local economic activity. We see generally there's a decline in trade, there's no one to protect the roads, there's no one to build the roads. So we do see there's a desire by local communities, a need by local communities to get what you need in your own community. You can't depend on overland or overseas trade. So we do see a desire for self-sufficiency, and that system of self-sufficiency that emerges is a general economic system known as manorialism. Manorialism is going to emerge as the major and dominant economic system of Western Europe during the Middle Ages. And manorialism essentially describes the local community organization during the Middle Ages. So remember, Europe is dominated by landed aristocrats, and these landed aristocrats own manors. They own huge plots of estates and all the land, all the buildings on those estates. But they also have control over local peasants known as serfs. So manorialism is going to be this system in which land owned by a lord who lives in a manor, they are going to basically control all of the agricultural production in their estates. So we do see that there will be a system of obligation that emerges in which serfs, people who cannot leave the estate, who cannot leave the land, they have to produce a certain amount of agricultural produce for the service of the lord. So we do see this system of exchange. The serfs provide food for the manor, whereas the lord of the manor, they have to defend the serf. So the community under manorialism is self-sufficient. They don't need to trade. There's a system of constant sustainable agriculture known as the three-field system. And you've probably already encountered this in Enviro, or to a degree, maybe even Human Geo. But it's the idea of crop rotation, if you will. And the three-field system essentially is this idea that you have three fields in a community. Two of the fields are planted, meaning that they're growing things like wheat or barley, things that are used to make bread. A lot of medieval serfs make and eat bread. But the other field is going to lie in what we call fallow. It's basically going to rest until the nutrients can come back. So we do see that there is a very complex organization of self-sufficiency in local communities based on agriculture. So if you're answering that second lesson objective, think about how we have the lives of everyday people in the Middle Ages. Most of them are serfs. Most of them produce food in exchange for protection from the lord. And serfdom is going to be largely the organization of labor in Western Europe, really until the modern era, really until the rise of capitalism. And we'll talk about that later. But serfdom is going to basically describe the livelihood of most of the people in Europe. And serfs oftentimes, well, they have some legal rights. A noble can't just kill them. Serfs aren't slaves. But serfs do need a lot of permission from the lord to do anything. They can't leave the land without the permission of the lord. They can't marry unless they have the permission of the lord. So serfs aren't slaves. That's a common misconception people have. But they do have limited economic and social freedoms. Yes. So if you're thinking about how to answer that second question, think about that serfdom is largely emerging in this economic system of manorialism. We do see manorialism being the focus of the European economy. It's focused on agriculture. All right, let's keep going. I'm not going to play the video, but what are some results of manorialism? Well, manorialism is going to increase the economic power and political and social power of landed aristocrats. We do see a lot of economic trust, in a way, being given to landed nobles. Serfs depend on them for their protection, and the serfs have to give the nobles their produce. So we do see that there is going to be a lot of economic and social power being given to the landed aristocrats. We also see that manorialism, because it encourages self-sufficiency, it discourages trade, we are going to start to see trade decline even further. And because of this, we do see a limited amount of technological innovation. We don't see technological innovation under this system of manorialism. We also don't see any class mobility as well. Class mobility is extremely limited in this system of manorialism, and we don't really see serfs rising above where they are in life. And the clip I have is a clip from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. If you haven't seen the movie, please do. It's not important for your education, but it is important for your, well, I think it's a good movie, and other people do too. I'm not going to play the clip. So what's the difference between feudalism and manorialism? Well, I'm just going to answer it for you, actually, because a lot of people get confused on this. Manorialism is more focused on the community, whereas feudalism is a general structure of a kingdom. It's a system of military and political relationships, and it's mostly describing the relationships on the top between kings and vassals, between kings and nobles. Whereas manorialism describes more of an economic system, generally in Western Europe, that is going to see kind of this idea of a more local, self-sufficient community. Manorialism is a part of feudalism. It's the economic system of feudalism is a way to distinguish these two ideas. So let's wrap up by looking at religion. Let's look at the Catholic Church. Well, the Catholic Church is going to be largely a dominant cultural, political institution in medieval Western Europe. So the church is going to be a very structured, very rigid hierarchy in which we are going to see that the Pope basically has his own political and economic power. And largely the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, it's inspired by the Roman Empire. So if we see that idea of continuity, it's expressed, for example, with the Roman Catholic Church. And we can call the members who lead the Catholic Church. These are the clergy. And the clergy kind of extend from the Pope all the way up here. We have the cardinals, who are given kind of their own special territory in the confines of the Catholic Church. There's kind of decentralized power in a way, because we do have cardinals. They are given their own plots of territory called dioceses or of archdioceses. We have cardinals basically are the religious leaders of like countries, basically. So there's a cardinal in England. And below them, we have archbishops. They rule over smaller religious domains called dioceses. The bishops, they own diocese, like a single diocese. We have priests. They're in charge of a smaller section of a diocese called a parish. And the parish priest is really the one most commoners come into contact with the most. And really kind of the parish priest is responsible for collecting local taxes called tithes. And these tithes essentially go up and up the scale. We do see a lot of these tithes being given up to the central power of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope. And the Pope is going to be a very wealthy man. Well, I mean, he's not supposed to be, but he's getting a lot of money that's going towards the building of huge cathedrals that we'll talk about later. But as such, the Pope is going to have a lot of economic power. And the Pope is going to be the one who decides culture in Western Europe. So the Catholic Church is going to impact the secular world specifically because they have a lot of economic and political power. The Pope and the Catholic Church as a whole is going to be the dominant cultural force in Western Europe. For example, they're the ones in charge of what is being read. They are largely going to be the only literate people in Western Europe. They speak and write in Latin. And as such, the dominance of religion is expressed over all of Western society. The Catholic Church decides what is acceptable intellectual and cultural expression. So we do see a discouragement of ideas that are opposed to the Catholic Church. We see the discouragement of secular philosophy, of Greek and Roman pagan writings. So we do see that the Catholic Church dominates the secular cultural world. And we'll see how that's challenged during the Renaissance. And then the laity, that's everybody else. That's everyone that's not a clergy member. That's you and me. Unless you watching, you're a priest, then you're not a lay person. So we do see that the Pope is going to be a major political player in Western Europe. And one example of how much power the Pope has is through a body called the Holy Roman Empire. To be clear, the Pope is not the leader of the HRE, of the Holy Roman Empire. A guy by the name of the Holy Roman Emperor is. He's picked out through an election of German-speaking nobles called electors. They almost always come from a family called the Habsburgs, and we'll talk about them much more later on. But the Holy Roman Empire is going to ultimately, at the end of the day, need to seek permission from the Catholic Church, from the Pope. The Pope is going to be the major political influencer of the Holy Roman Empire. He's taking away a lot of power from the Holy Roman Emperor, who, by the way, doesn't have a lot of power to begin with. The Holy Roman Empire, nobody listens to him. The Holy Roman Emperor, nobody listens to him. The Holy Roman Empire is not much of an empire. It's a collection of like 300 different German-speaking states. So really kind of political power is not even in the hands of the emperor. It's in the hands of the Pope or the aristocrats. So the Holy Roman Empire is an example of decentralization, of feudalism in general, and it's most comparable to something like, say, the Japanese during this time, medieval feudal Japan. But we also see that there are going to be attempts by the secular government to try and take away power from the Catholic Church. And we largely see that through the idea of investiture. And we'll talk about what that means in a second. But essentially, it means the right for a secular leader to pick out a religious leader. Who's going to be the cardinal of, say, England or the Holy Roman Empire? Well, who gets to decide that? Largely, there's going to be a controversy. Is it the Pope or is it the king? And we see that expressed in a few different controversies. So we see that with Henry II in England. He says, oh, I want to be the guy that picks out the bishops in England. And then his advisor, Thomas Becket, says, no, Henry II kills him. But at the end of the day, who retains the power to appoint Catholic clergy members? It's the Catholic Church. It's the Pope. A similar event happens in the Holy Roman Empire, the investiture controversy. Essentially, the Holy Roman Emperor is going to say, hey, I should be the one that picks out the cardinals. I should be the one that picks out the clergy. But then the Pope is like, no. And on top of that, if you don't stop picking out cardinals, I'm going to throw you out of the church. And eventually the Pope does. The emperor comes back to the flock, so to say, by saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. He's like naked in a snow field at one point. You don't need to know that. But at the end of the day, both of these controversies over who gets to pick the religious leaders of the Catholic Church, at the end of the day, it's the Pope. So we do see that political power over religion is very limited in the Western world. That's something we don't see in the Islamic world. It's something we don't see in the Orthodox Byzantine world. But finally, one more note about the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages. Well, the Catholic Church is largely going to be the dominant intellectual power of the Middle Ages. And largely, all intellectual developments are going to occur under the purview of something called monasticism. Monasticism essentially describes the idea of removing oneself from the secular or non-religious world and That's where monasteries come into being. Monks and nuns, they live in monasteries away from the non-religious world. And they're focused on spiritualism. They're focused especially on translating the Bible into Latin. The Bible's originally written in Greek and Hebrew, just as a heads up. But these monks, they're largely going to be the literate class. They're the ones they're the ones developing art. So really, monasticism is going to be an example of how the Catholic Church controls intellectual and cultural life during the Middle Ages. But we are going to see a lot of problems in the Catholic Church that will eventually break out into the Protestant Reformation, which we'll talk about more in Unit 3. Some of these problems in the Catholic Church, they include things like corruption. The Pope is basically a corrupt figure. He's getting a lot of kickbacks and financial, a lot of money is flowing to the papacy. We do see corruption as well morally. Priests are having kids, they're having affairs, they're not supposed to even be married or have sex with people. So we do see that there is kind of a moral and financial corruption crisis in the Catholic Church. And eventually there are going to be different ways to try and bring Christianity, Catholicism specifically, back to a more humble and more moral state. But at the end of the day, as we're going to see with the Reformation, they're not that successful. For example, we have the Gregorian reforms. There is going to be this attempt, hey, maybe priests have to be celibate. Maybe priests shouldn't marry. That's going to be clarified during the Gregorian reforms under the direction of Pope Gregory. We also see the rise of what we call mendicant orders. And these essentially are kind of like Buddhist ascetists, if you will. They are going to deprive themselves of material goods. They are going to take vows of poverty. And they are kind of challenging the financial corruption of the Catholic Church. The Pope shouldn't be making millions and millions of dollars. We should be focused on charity towards the poorest of Europe. So we do see the rise of mendicant orders, for example, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Cistercians. They're all examples of kind of how we see attempts for more charity in Western Europe to solve the problem of corruption. Hey, Pope, we should lead lives of moral and lives of moral goodness and humility and poverty. But as we're going to see with the Reformation, nobody listens to these people. They're cool because they want to help people, but no one's going to listen to them, leading to instances of corruption. And that's going to lead us to the Reformation, which we'll talk about more in Unit 3. So you should be able to describe the Catholic Church, but more importantly, describe how the Catholic Church is controlling and affecting secular or non-religious society. Thank you very much. It's fourth period now. Goodbye.